Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Intrigue Explained. If you missed our first show, this is where me and my co-host, John, say hi.
Hello, everyone. How are we?
There. He said hi. Now I just proceed to talk for 60 minutes. It's a kind of rapport we
And,
have.
and I nod. Good
Mm,
point, Dimitri.
yeah. I should just pay people to follow me around and nod sagely at all my comments. I think it'd be great. Um, so So this show is myself from Explain Trade and John from International Intrigue, which are basically two companies that both try to explain complexity. And in this case, it's me tagging along with really the International Intrigue train to try to explain some of the complexity around some of the breaking news stories of the week in international relations and global affairs. Um, John, tell us a little bit about what International Intrigue does and what the newsletter is.
So, we are basically a 5 minute morning briefing for folks who are interested in what's going on around the world. As you said, international relations, a focus on emerging geopolitics and things people need to kind of just be aware of in places that might not be in the mainstream media. It's a short newsletter. We try to keep it relatively bright and bubbly to the extent that you can when it's global affairs. But the idea is that it's just something that you open every morning, you have a look through, and you feel like you're relatively informed about what's going on in the world.
The way we'll be trying to do this show, the format we'll be using, is that every week we ask John and his team to pick out five of the stories that they covered that we want to dive into. We try to have a geographically broad grab bag. And then we also deep dive on one particular story that we think is especially interesting to explore. And we come at that story from our perspective as two former Australian diplomats, have been in some of the rooms where foreign policy decisions are made, or I think more commonly mulled, but not actually made, delayed until they're absolutely inevitable and then rushed through. Not to
Taking
shit.
notes, to be clear.
Yeah, exactly. Taking notes so that you can't be blamed for not having gone on the record. So that's the outline of our show, as well as every week we beg and plead on Twitter and Mastodon for people to send us questions they'd like us to tackle at the end of the show, things that don't have to be about our core stories, but about any aspect of international relations. And assuming we don't blather on far too long in the main segments, we try to get to those while trying to get you out of here in 45 minutes. We didn't quite succeed last time, but we do try.
Good to have goals.
It's important to have dreams. Speaking of dreams, thank you so much to the over 100 of you who subscribed after our first episode. It's good to know we didn't completely alienate you. For everyone else, please do drop us a like and subscribe. Please do jump in the comments and tell us what we're doing wrong with the show, with our lives, just personal grooming choices. Really, there is a plethora of things you could have a go at us for. So please don't hesitate to do that. And as well as after every show throughout the week, we try to release individual segments in shorter clips so that you have something that you can go back to, that you can share with others, that's hopefully a little bit more digestible than a big 45-minute piece. And with that, we can go straight to John covering our first quick take story of the week.
Yeah, so this is the first of five stories that we're going to cover, and we thought we'd start off with something that didn't make as much news as I expected it to, but it's that Western components were found in Iranian-made drones that were being used by Russia. Ukrainian intelligence linked three-quarters of Iranian drone components to US companies and some Japanese, German, Chinese, and Israeli firms as well. And of course, Iran has transferred, I think, a couple of hundred, don't quote me on those numbers, but a couple of hundred drones to Russia to support their invasion of Ukraine. And that's how Ukrainian intelligence came across an Iranian drone to deconstruct. The rub here, of course, and Dimitri, I'll be interested in your take, is that Iran is under sanctions, which makes the procurement of those components illegal. Clearly, something isn't working.
Yeah, so we give ourselves 60 seconds of hot takes on all of these things in order to stop from blathering. And I know, John, you wanted to dig into that sanctions question and are the sanctions working? And I'd be really interested in your views on it. I wanted to kind of go to the end of that piece and think about the fact that a lot of the commentary on this Iranian drone program kept speaking about the fact that it's such an advanced program. They've made so many homegrown advances. It's such a formidable presence in the region. But I think the other thing that this revealed, apart from the sanctions piece you're going to talk about, is that fundamentally, the Iranian drone program was still a design and assembly program. This is a program that does not work without Western components that are not homegrown. And I think there are obvious parallels here with the Russian armed forces, which very quickly discovered once sanctions hit that they could no longer build a whole bunch of things, beginning with tanks and missiles, and frankly ending with their entire automotive sector, which is also all about assembly. John, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously largely agree with you. I think the sanctions piece is interesting, not so much that the sanctions are failing, which I don't think it's black and white, like they're succeeding or they're failing. And I think that's what a lot of the media coverage misses about sanctions. The idea isn't that they will be 100% perfect. I mean, in an ideal world, they would be, but the idea is that you make it incredibly difficult. You drive a lot of this stuff underground, which means it's harder to perfect acquiring components. You can't establish clear supply chains out in the open. So even if you're the US Department of State policy planning, whatever they are, and they're saying, okay, what's the best case scenario for these sanctions? If they're being realistic, it looks a lot more like, well, Iran's probably going to be able to get components for their weapons, but if things go wrong, they won't be able to easily be resupplied. They'll always be looking over their shoulder on these supply chains because they're technically illegal. It's going to be a lot more work to do what an unsanctioned country can do out in the open. So I think the sanctions piece is right. Like, sanctions don't work, or there's ways to always get around sanctions. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't useful in hampering and making it really, really difficult for these kinds of regimes to get their hands on components. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater just because of this story, I guess is what I would say.
I agree. The one thing I would throw into that basket is sanctions, like a lot of laws, are 10% law, 90% enforcement.
Right.
One of the reasons that the sanctions against Russia appear to be working is that the message went out loud and clear that there would be zero tolerance. There was so much focus. Some companies unilaterally pulled out without even necessarily being directly affected by the sanctions. And there was this sense that the EU and the US would be quick off the mark with secondary sanctions against, say, Chinese firms that chose to violate sanctions against or sell through to Russia. Whereas I'm not as certain the same level of focus has been there on Iran.
Right. Yeah, in terms of people being like, if we find you, we will bring the full force of our whatever to bear. Yeah, that's a very fair point.
Exactly. Nobody wants to wake up with the Commerce Department standing over them, but the Commerce
Ugh,
Department can only look. You haven't had that dream?
Nightmare.
Yeah.
All right, shall we do our second quick take?
Absolutely. So our next topic.
This is the sad news. I think it was about a week ago now, last Sunday, so 13th of November, of a terror attack in Istanbul in Turkey. So what happened was there was a bombing in Istanbul in a very famous part. If you've been to Istanbul and stayed on the European side of Istanbul, you probably walk down this street. It's one of the main streets in the main tourist area. 6 people were killed and 80 odd others were injured by the explosion. Turkish officials blamed the Kurdistan Workers' Party. This is a Kurdish militant group that is strongest in the far southeast of Turkey on the border of Syria and Iraq. And since the attack, the Turkish government has bombed and has retaliated against those targets in that part of Turkey/Syria with bombings and artillery. And I've seen some reports in German newspapers too that internet speeds and access to social media within Turkey for like Turkish citizens has been reduced too. So obviously the Turkish government is taking it very serious.
Yeah, I mean, this one's a tough one to react to because this is one of those situations where the terrorist attack was horrific. The reaction, it is very difficult to say that airstrikes and artillery attacks are an effective response against terrorism. It veers into reprisal, but at the same time, it is understanding the politics anywhere when you have terrorist attacks occur in a major city, when a country feels attacked, as it has for a very long time. You understand where players are coming from and don't feel like you're in a ground to judge. The one thing I wanted to focus on is really that Erdogan and Turkey are in many ways the sleepers of global relations. Erdogan has had a phenomenal run in terms of coalescing his domestic power, moving Turkey into a more religious place when previously it was thought the military, which sees itself as the guardians of Turkish secularism, wouldn't allow it. He stared down Putin over the grain deal and the Bosphorus Strait. He stared down Europe in a lot of ways, using the threat of mass migration as a cudgel. And he has basically emerged as this massive regional player and regional kingmaker. And that's flying below a lot of people's radars who don't follow the region closely.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on with that. And as usual, this is just a back and forth of furious agreement. But I think the one interesting angle here is what you alluded to at the end there, which is the regional geopolitics of this. The cynical Turkish watchers, of which I'm not an expert in that area at all, but people who are think that Erdogan uses these kinds of attacks, and not to say there's any conspiracy theories behind the attacks happening, but he uses the fallout of these attacks to, push forward what I think those cynics would call a more colonial kind of agenda. The idea that northern Syria and northern Iraq, where Kurdistan is really should be under control by Turkish authorities, and that they should drive the Kurds away. These kinds of long-standing, I suppose, geopolitical goals, but almost like ethnic goals of Erdogan and his party. He uses these kinds of events to justify that. Now, again, I don't have a great knowledge of the history of the area, but one interesting thing is that there's two Kurdish militant groups in that part of the world. One is the PKK, and the other is the YPG. The YPG is the one that is based in Syria and helped the US fight ISIS. So they aren't on a terror list because they helped the US fight ISIS. The other one didn't, and because Turkey is fighting the PKK, they are on a terror list. And ostensibly, there's differences between the groups, but there's not enough differences perhaps to justify that kind of discrepancy, which I think is an interesting reflection of how the region's geopolitics.
Let's jump to our next story.
Yeah, so this is big news, obviously. It's North Korea tested yet another ballistic missile last Thursday, the 17th. It's their most powerful ballistic missile. It's called the Hwasong-17, which is interesting because that's the missile that North Korea unveiled a couple of years ago, and it was the big daddy missile, and it made waves, but they've had a lot of trouble launching it. So this was, I think, if not the first, a pretty significant advancement in how North Korea is able to launch their biggest missiles. And it landed 200 kilometers off the coast of Japan, which caused Japan and South Korea to be very upset, understandably. And North Korea's, that's the 88th missile, I think, by some measures, that they've launched this year, which is the most they've ever launched, which obviously also contravenes United Nations Security Council resolutions. So pretty big news.
Yeah, I mean, this is another one of those stories where, what do you say? The lesson that everybody took away from the axis of evil was that if you want to be the country that doesn't get invaded, you should probably have a nuclear program. It was very hard to look at the countries that were included in the axis of evil and look at the ones that ended up being invaded and which one didn't. And the one that didn't tended to be the ones with more advanced nuclear programs, or which could hold Seoul hostage with massive amounts of regular tube artillery buried in the mountains. So this is one of those issues where, from the perspective of the Kim regime, the nuclear program is their final guarantor of safety. And it is very difficult to see any kind of policy tools that would make them give that up. With that said, is there some way forward where we find a more effective way to discourage this kind of performative saber rattling? And are we giving him what he wants when he tests a missile that is frankly 1950s technology? I mean, ICBMs are not fresh off the rack, and everybody pays attention to him again. I guess my question is, from a policy perspective, given we can't make him give up his nukes, are we actually making a mistake by making this a big deal? And I suspect you disagree.
Well, I agree with the nuclear deterrent being a big lesson out of what you were saying out of the Axis powers. I think that's been shown again by Ukraine, obviously, who gave up nuclear power after the fall of the Soviet Union. And look what happens now. And the way Russia wields that nuclear threat to its advantage. I do disagree that we shouldn't be making a big deal of it. It's obviously what Kim wants. He wants the attention. It's provocation, and it's, if you're again reading deep into the geopolitical teacup of why he's doing it, it's China is probably not unthrilled that he does this because it gives Japan, South Korea, and the US another thing to think about in the region rather than just focusing on China. But the North Korean state media agency specifically said we were simulating the nuclear attacks on Seoul and Japan.
Mhm.
Specifically saying we are simulating nuclear attacks is an absolutely outrageous thing to do in 2022. Not even Russia or any of the others do that. And I think if you ignore it, you normalize it, and you allow them to ratchet it up even further, because we are dealing with someone who wants attention. And if you don't give it, that doesn't mean they go, oh, that didn't work, off I go and just behave myself. They go, okay, well, I actually need to prove that I can do this because no one thinks I'm serious. So like, let's try something else out. So I do think we need to make it a huge deal. And the second reason is that you risk getting into moral equivalency arguments if you start saying, oh, well, that's what they always do. Every time these kinds of outrageous things happen, the international community needs to put a marker in it and say, no, this is bad. Morally, security-wise, everything. This is bad. So I think it's important.
I think that's fair. I think it's also something I guess I didn't think about was if we tolerate it and if we don't make it a big deal for Kim Jong-un's North Korea, does it send a message that developing ICBM programs is just fine for everyone? That this is just the normal course of doing business? Is there value to being outraged each and every time, even for something that is unfortunately increasingly commonplace, at least where North Korea is? Just to say, we still don't think this is on.
Right. It's an issue, I guess, of calibration there, where you choose to minimize some things. It's a difficult question. You're right.
All right. Next one.
Okay, so we're skipping away from Asia and moving to Africa here. And this is the story that until recently, until like Wednesday, fighting was getting worse in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. So this is the news that insurgent groups, primarily the Rwandan-backed M23 rebel group, have been involved in the heaviest fighting in the east of DRC for years. Now, the M23 is a rebel group that is alleged to be backed by the Rwandan government. Obviously, the Rwandan government denies that. But the M23 group is made up of Congolese Tutsis who see themselves more Rwandan than they do perhaps Congolese. You know, that's very general, obviously. But the rub of it is that millions have been displaced in the fighting. It's drawing in players from around the region. It's got Africa's big players, the regional players, really focused on it. Uganda and Kenya are worried about it. So I guess the other development is that they signed a ceasefire 2 days ago, and there's questions about whether it'll hold or not.
One of the things that jumped out at me about this story, and this is not a region I know particularly well, is that this has a comparatively large deployment of UN troops that have been there for quite some time. And when I'm talking about large, I think the numbers I saw was something like M23 is estimated having 2,000 fighters, give or take, whereas the UN force deployment is 12,000. And still it has been ineffectual in preventing this violence from spreading. And I think that really highlights the incredible limits on UN peacekeeping anywhere, historically anywhere, but especially in conflicts that are far from the limelight, where, for those who don't know, when the UN sends troops somewhere, it is in fact troop contributions from individual member states, each of which comes with a document thicker than my arm that outlines their specific terms of engagement, what they can and can't be used for, what they will and won't do, and ends up creating a force that may look more than sufficient on paper, but in practice finds it hamstrung, paralyzed, and unable to play the role that I think is envisioned for it. And I know that's caused a lot of frustration in the Congo, with people saying, well, hold on, why aren't you protecting us? Why are you here?
Yeah, that's the point you made there at the end, is why you have to have, I mean, I'm sure there's a military doctrine rule of thumb about how many times more troops you need to deal with these kinds of insurgencies. But, you know, you're bringing in troops from Europe, from Asia, from Australia, from everywhere, or wherever the member states have contributed the troops to the UN fighting force. And it's probably actually more just regional African forces, but they're still fighting in a place they don't know well. As you said, they're limited by terms of engagement. And just like the lessons we're learning in the Ukraine war, again, it's much harder to keep peace and maintain stability over an area of land than it is to run away into the jungle, come in, blow something up, fight something, and then run away again. So these things are super, super hard to do. And it's why the political element of these are so important. Realistically, until the two governments or all the political leaders of all the factions involved, until they decide they don't want to fight anymore, there will be fighting. There just will be, because you can say, oh, yes, we'll stop fighting. But until Rwanda agrees to stop backing that group or tells them to stand down, until the Congo makes the necessarily, I don't want to say appeases Rwanda, but reaches an understanding with Rwanda, the fighting will continue. And thankfully, as I said at the start, when on Wednesday it looks like there was a ceasefire, and it is, I think in the terms of that ceasefire, it is understood that if the rebels take up arms again, then there will be a regional force from Africa that will go in and try and stop them. So I mean, I think it's good it's a great development, but we'll just have to see how long it holds.
Before we move off this onto the next topic, there is a rare earths element to pardon
Also
the
true.
awful pun. Jesus, what am I doing with my life? John, did you just want to say a few words about that? Because I think it's going to be a defining story of the 21st century.
And as we, particularly with climate investment and batteries and smartphones and electronics, the demand for rare earths is increasing, and will only increase. And the sad thing is that rare earths have to be dug out of the ground, and they're often in places where they're not particularly politically stable. So you can really probably expect these kinds of things, maybe not in this exact structure, but conflict and disagreements around rare earths, places where rare earths are, to increase. But I mean, it's easy just to put it down to that. This is obviously an ethnic, historical kind of thing as well, but that's the minerals element is also a big part of it.
I believe the mineral is called columbite tantalite, and it's effectively only found there. And it's one of these, again, it's one of these metals you've never heard of, but which turns out to be pivotal to making certain forms of high-tech electronics. And I think that's going to be an issue that comes up more and more, if we're being honest.
Plenty of different places, yeah.
So our next topic.
All right, well, we'll hit our last topic. We're running a bit late, but these are big stories, so they're kind of important to make sure we cover properly. This one is the story that Canadian police charged an employee of a hydropower facility in Canada with spying on behalf of China. They arrested him, I think, last week, it might have been, or a month, maybe early this week, I can't recall. But it comes against the backdrop, essentially, that Canada is going to announce a new Indo-Pacific strategy. These documents that are very bureaucratic, but actually are quite important when it comes to the world of foreign relations. That strategy is expected to be pretty frank about Canada's relationship with China. And again, that comes against a backdrop of, pretty bad relationships, pretty bad relation with China on behalf of Canada.
This is very much your turf. You were the one who was posted to China. But one thing that this kind of made me think of was Michael Hayden, the former director of the CIA and NSA, wrote 2 books, one of which was called Playing to the Edge. And in it, makes this comparison, and again, it's coming from the director of the NSA, let's take it with a grain of salt, that basically said, look, you've got, in terms of different espionage systems, especially in cyberspace, you have the US and Israelis who sneak into your systems and then sneak out without you ever knowing they were there. You have the Russians who sneak in and leave some traces, but make sure that those traces give them plausible deniability, so it looks like it was some kid in a basement in Siberia, so they can always claim it wasn't them. And then again, and this is, I'm paraphrasing him, this is my view, the Chinese hackers who will kick your front door in, spray Chinese graffiti and the name of their military unit on the inside of your server digitally, and then just walk out, because what are you going to do about it? And something that I think these increasing stories of Chinese espionage assets that are being, alleged espionage assets all over North America and Europe are revealing is that perhaps we in the West are not fully equipped to deal with an espionage player does not care that much if it gets caught. So much of what we've developed going back and forth was always these kind of shadow games. But what happens if you don't mind if a floodlight lands on you? Are we equipped to process shamelessness in espionage the way we prove to be really vulnerable to shamelessness in electoral?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. I think I would say that this kind of stuff that Canada caught, and there's been cases of the Justice Department in the US arresting folks in universities. I think that Chinese might respond by saying they aren't working for us in the same way that Russia does to the Siberian teenager in the basement. Even if they are MSS agents, it's not the kind of spying that we think of when we think of Mission Impossible. It's this industrial, widespread, secret stealing, understanding a system they don't understand kind of spying. But no, I think you are right. There's a broader question about how you deal with an adversary that's doesn't, you can't be shamed, right? But I think the interesting angle I wanted to just briefly mention was just how bad I think Canadian and Chinese relations are getting. As an Australian diplomat who was posted in China when things started to go pear-shaped for us, it feels very similar to what we went through, although even worse, perhaps. I was in China when China arrested Michael Kovrig, who was a Canadian. He was attached to the Canadian embassy, but he was there as a civilian with his girlfriend at the time, and they arrested him, calling him a spy and all this kind of stuff in response to Canada arresting the daughter of the founder of Huawei because she was wanted in America. And then obviously at the G20, Xi Jinping publicly rebuked Trudeau for leaking conversations that they'd had. So, and we'll post a link to that because the video is one of the most awkward things I've seen in foreign relations, where Xi Jinping says you're behaving poorly and Trudeau doesn't know what to do, but just hits his talking points. But the broader point here is that Canada-China relations are pretty bad, and I wouldn't expect them to get any better anytime soon. So how Canada responds, both from a government sense, what the politicians say, and what the private sector says about China, will be very interesting in the near future. Interesting.
It's a brave new world.
Mm.
So that brings us to our main story, which is COP27 and the climate outcomes. And I know there will be debate over the use of the word outcomes there. But John, do you want to talk us through with maybe a little bit of what COP was, what it is?
It sounds very final. What it was, let's pull one out. I feel like we had to cover this week just because I think it was a little bit undercovered generally, but also it's super important, right? So for those who aren't necessarily aware what it is, it's the UN Climate Change Conference. Conference of Parties is the COP bit, which is typical UN dexterity.
Completely incomprehensible.
I know. It's a running joke in our newsletter about just like someone needs to start a marketing agency that works for international organizations just to help them move away from this kind of nonsense. But anyway,
you don't think that was $3 million in consultancy fees?
All right. Yeah, exactly.
Please, John.
They need to get better consultants. Anyway, the conference was held over 2 weeks in Egypt, and it wrapped up last Sunday. It was supposed to wrap up on Saturday, but they pushed it for an extra day to push through emergency negotiations. Obviously, this comes against the backdrop of terrible floods in Pakistan in September, which I think had huge swathes of the country underwater, and that becomes emblematic of the climate challenge facing the world. But then also the Ukraine-Russia war, which people are more focused on than maybe less tangible results about how to combat climate change. So there's this real tension at the moment between things that are urgent and immediate, and the fact that it's getting harder and harder to act like climate change isn't urgent and immediate. The results were, well, we can get into that, but it happened at the same time as all the leaders were in the G20 in Bali. So I think that also probably shifted a bit of focus away. But Dimitri, what were your takeaways from the results of COP?
So Professor, I wasn't surprised that it went over. Most multilateral negotiations I've ever been a part of end up going over, because it is only when you are staring down the barrel of no outcome at all that ministers begin to move off red lines. And then once they've done that, you're like, yeah, cool. We now need to find language that captures this. Like, how do we make this real? So I'm not surprised by that. I will say, looking at it, these COPs, these major conferences, will aim to do 70 things at once. But the three things that it seemed were the focus of this one was, firstly, damage and loss. So creating a fund that would effectively channel money to those countries and those communities that have been irreparably harmed by a worsening climate. Second, there was an attempt by some members to water down the 1.5 degree target, by some to defend it, and by some to improve it. And so there was a massive fight over that. And then thirdly, this was seen by the Egyptian hosts as an implementation COP, where at previous COPs, members had made all sorts of pledges, and the Egyptians wanted to use this COP to look at how governments were actually putting those pledges into action, because the climate community has a lot of frustrations with people said things, but they don't appear to be doing them. John, on this 1.5 degree question and on the climate, high inflation, everybody is freaking out about energy prices. Did this have a hope in hell
No is the short answer, right? Like you could probably give a craftier answer that, that's probably a little bit more accurate, but no is the short answer. If you look at politicians in the countries that participated, it's artificially framed as take care of your people or deal with climate change. I mean, I think you absolutely can do both. But when the rubber meets the road, there were a lot of people who were saying to do some of the things that the COP would ask us to do would mean short-term higher energy prices for our people, which at this time is a political non-starter. They've got to get re-elected, or at the very least, they have a duty of care to their citizens to not push a cost of living crisis even higher. When I framed the question as takes place against the backdrop of Ukraine and Russia war, and I meant attention-wise, but what you're drilling down there is like that war has changed the fundamental dynamics of what politicians are willing to do when it comes to solving collective action problems. Because they're saying when everything's peaceful, we can look beyond our borders and we can say, oh, let's like deal with some of these really difficult questions, blah, blah, blah. Oh, wait, the wolf is metaphorically at the door. Let's get our house in order. I mean, that's how I would frame it. So the answer is no, it didn't have a hope in hell of getting through this COP. But then I ask myself, and maybe it's an inappropriate question, but like, is it just a convenient excuse that you can say it's a true excuse? But what would it, absent the war, would we have gotten there? I mean, I'm getting more cynical about this stuff. And, living in America, every election cycle, people scream about gas prices, and rightly so. That's a big part of people's budgets. But at some point, these kinds of things, these kinds of commitments to combat climate change require people to be out of pocket, to pay more, to make difficult decisions. And I haven't seen much political will anywhere really to kind of actually properly do that. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you can't help but think that if the test for climate action is that there is absolutely nothing bad going on in the world, and that there are
Yeah.
no pressures on working families, as politicians call them, shorthand for like everybody. If we wait until some moment when absolutely everyone in the country is
Ready to deal with it,
content
right?
and ready to
Yeah.
make sacrifices, we are not going to make a difference.
No.
But I would say, kind of on a more optimistic note, what we've seen over and over again is, at least by some metrics, actual performance has exceeded commitments in all sorts of ways. The pace of renewables have raced ahead of even what governments have been willing to commit to.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's right. I think maybe that's for people who are saying the government central, the government idea that governments should drive climate change efforts. The people who would push back against that say you can only ever do so much as a government. The people who
Yeah.
need to actually be involved in this is the private sectors. I mean, the people who develop the technologies that are going to help us move from fossil fuels to renewables are not going to be, or very rarely are they going to be, the government organizations doing it. They're the ones who can set the conditions, the signals for the private sector to go and invest. And so in one case, I'm not surprised that once there is a clear understanding of where the market is going and where investment is going to go and where the investment rules are going to go, then I'm not surprised that renewable adoption outpaces what we thought. Because once you have everyone pulling in the same direction, solves a lot of the problems. I think that's one of the key things to note from this COP, and why I'm a little bit more optimistic about what came out of this COP than I think many are in the media. And that's this climate fund reparations bit, whatever you want to call it, this idea that developing, poor, emerging countries expected to be hit by climate change disproportionately, there's a fund there, or there's at least the signal of a fund that will say, we are going to compensate you for the changes that you're going to have to make, because we know that it's not going to be cheap and it's not fair on you. And before I throw it back to you, I think the reason I use the word signal there is that's so important, because it says Western governments are going to provide money. We're going to prepare the ground for private investment to focus on this. Presumably, they've got the developing countries on board who are saying, we're going to create the investment conditions that you can come into our country and feel more safe than you might otherwise would with a normal private sector investment. And then if you can kind of get those signals matched up, that's when you start to hopefully get the financiers in and the companies, startups or whatever it is, coming in to actually make a difference. But these things happen over years, decades, which is, I guess, the fundamental tension of climate change, is we probably don't have that long.
On that fund, a lot of the criticism, and I think it's entirely legitimate, is that they agreed the notion of a fund. They did
Yeah.
not agree any of the details of the fund, including where the money will come from, apart from a general direction. They haven't agreed how it will be distributed. They haven't agreed the criteria. And so it is, I think, entirely legitimate for the activist community to say, well, yeah, but is this actually going to happen? Where is
Right.
the money? Is this going to be an empty shell of a fund? And I do think that's a legitimate criticism.
Totally.
What
I agree.
what I would say, though, on the flip side, is so much of the UN is about precedent and statements of fundamental belief and value. Things like common but differentiated responsibility when it comes to climate, this idea that everyone has a responsibility to deal with climate change, but you have to differentiate between different countries in how much. Getting that across the line completely reshaped all of the climate processes thereafter for years. And
Yeah.
so I do think there is tremendous value in actually agreeing at a multilateral level, the COP level, the fundamental premise that A, climate change is going to cause damage that can't be locally repaired, B, that there is a duty and an obligation, a global community to help address it, and
Mm.
C, that the burden of that responsibility should fall on the historic polluters.
Yeah. And that's what I was talking about with the signal, right?
Yeah.
Like the idea that like this is what we're telling. Now there's a lot of meat to be put on the bones, and a lot of things can change. But like the signal is these things are what we believe, and we're going to figure out the rest as we go along. And the activist community, as you said, is entirely right to be frustrated by the pace of that.
Yeah.
They're frustrated by the fact that there's no details, no commitments, nothing can be held against anybody else because these agreements are always drafted to be so vague as to be not worth much. But the signal is, I think, really important. And the fact is, this is the most complicated negotiation to deal with. I mean, if you were doing this in one of your explain trade mock negotiation workshops, you wouldn't be able to mock up all the different variables and interests and parties, and it's like orders of magnitude. So in one sense, it's quite amazing that we're even able to get what we get out of it. Now, that doesn't mean we should all put the tools down and say, "Good job, aren't we? Great, we came up with an agreement to say we'll agree in the future." But I don't think that doom and gloom is necessarily the way to approach this, both from the media and from people's attitudes towards it, because there is some good news about the signals.
Just a final
Or am I
thought.
struggling? Am I coping too hard? Maybe.
Well, listen, somebody's got to. Something that this is going to be like a note that is of relevance to like 3 people worldwide, but something that I found quite funny in a sad way reading the negotiations about this fund is that it tripped up on something that the WTO has been tripping up on for 10 years, which is when they started defining who the fund is for, the developed countries wanted to differentiate between very large economies like China and other developing countries, which developing countries didn't want to do because they see that as splintering. And of course, China massively objected to. And so where they ended up is where a lot of the WTO negotiations recently have ended up, with language that says that wealthier developing countries can choose to contribute to this fund, and that the priority for the fund's money will go to countries that are a little bit less economically powerful than others. But it was just a very funny parallel how this keeps coming up of how do you give developing countries something without giving it to a country that you don't consider to be a valid recipient of aid or assistance because of the size of their economy. Just that all roads lead to depressing Rome is, I guess, what I wanted to finish this one on.
Here I am trying to find whatever silver lining there is, and then the
Nah.
last word goes to you, where you're like everything's pretty fucked.
Yeah. On that note of everything pretty fucked, question we got from Twitter that I wanted to throw to you: are we seeing a fundamentally new type of international relations emerging, or are we still basically where we've been since World War II?
I mean, that's such a difficult question. I think my gut, I'll answer it with just gut feeling because, George
Vibe
Bush
check us.
Exactly. I think that the answer is no. There's nothing fundamentally new about what's emerging. I think there's a reordering, a multipolarity, which is one of those disgusting words that comes up in IR textbooks. But the idea that there isn't just one country or even two countries that can dictate to the rest of the world how things are going to be done. It's going to be groups. And I mean, you talked about this last week, the idea that a bunch of countries can group together and become very, very powerful. But you've also got India, and then Russia and China's effort to make the BRICS a big thing. That you have this idea that there's going to be a bunch of different centers of power, not all equal, of course, but relatively able to stop others from doing things. And that's the key idea. So that doesn't mean it's a new international relations model. I think we talked about this last week again, that I don't think the UN or many of the multilateral kind of organizations are going to go anywhere. I think most countries want to work within the system that was established post World War II, but they want to change it internally so it works for them. Really, I think the countries that would want to burn down the global order are, you could name them you could list them on one hand, and they're not going to be able to do it. So I don't think it's a new international framework. I do think that the power centers are changing, and that we're going to have to re-examine a lot of the original thinking on everything basically post Cold War. We're going to have to go back and go, does that hold in a world where India has a lot of power, where Brazil has a lot of power, where Russia is a client state of China, but China is incredibly powerful, and all of these kinds of questions?
Yeah, I think that's fundamentally right. The international relations are the same. There are a few more actors, and the balance of power has been shifting around. I think the most interesting thing about this new international order is the emergence of the mega corporation and the billionaire, this Twitter, Meta, or even like massive funds like BlackRock. And the question is, like, to what extent are they now part of the equation the way they maybe weren't before? But I don't necessarily know that they have been transformational enough for us to say, we are in a new world. I think we're still pretty much in the world we were, but there's like a metaverse terminal in the corner.
Right, yeah.
That nobody's using.
No, I agree.
Can't stress that enough. Nobody's using that metaverse terminal. People want legs, and the metaverse doesn't have.
Even if we don't use them. Yeah, exactly. No, I agree.
So that's good. We end on an agreement. That's always positive. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this second episode. To answer a frequently asked question, we are definitely hoping to begin releasing these as podcasts after the fact. In order to do that, though, we would have to get our sound balancing right, which we certainly didn't do last week. So we wanted to do a few more and make sure that folks like this format, like what we're doing, let us refine it some more, and then go from there.
Yeah, and to that point, I would encourage anybody who comes across these to just like drop your notes in the comments or reach out to us, because it's super helpful if you say, oh, I don't like this, or I like that, or you guys need to do a bit more of this, a bit less of that, loved this, hated that. Because essentially what we're doing is we're doing a few trial runs to create something that hopefully you'll actually find useful and want to watch every week or listen to. So you can kind of take this as your personal chance to shape what we do, to make it your own personal briefing, which we're fundamentally a democracy here, Dimitri. We're trying to create what the people want.
Yes, as narrowly interpreted by what I can do with Open Broadcast Studio, which we very quickly run into some limits on. But every comment you give me gives me an excuse to go down the rabbit hole of playing with tech, which is really brightens my day. So with that, thank you again so much. We will put, as we always do, links to some of the readings we relied on to put together today's episode down in the video description. We will also, of course, put a link to the International Intrigue newsletter that you can get daily and that we advertise at the top of the show right there, so you can subscribe with just a few clicks. Thank you for joining me, John, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for watching. If you like what you saw, please give us a like, a comment, and subscribe to the channel to be notified as soon as we put up new videos. Also, don't forget that down below is a link to the amazing International Intrigue free daily newsletter so that you can be ahead of the news of those water cooler conversations. Thanks so much.